Hello there, and welcome back to Sleep Orion. Maybe you've had a long day, or perhaps you just like falling asleep while thinking about ancient journeys rather than counting sheep. Either way, tonight's adventure is for you. You don't need to do anything now but rest. Let your thoughts slow down, allow your breathing to soften, and notice your body feeling lighter as the weight of the day drifts away. Tonight we follow the footsteps of one of history's greatest travelers, Marco Polo, whose journey along the Silk Road and across the Gobi Desert would change the world forever. A path shaped by ancient trade routes, unseen dangers, and landscapes so vast they unfold far beyond imagination. The Silk Road stretched slowly across continents, carrying treasures, stories, and a young Venetian merchant who would witness wonders few Europeans had ever seen. Marco Polo's travels hold countless mysteries, each one stranger than the next. If you enjoy these gentle journeys through history, consider liking, subscribing, or sharing a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, if you're ready, let's begin our journey to the east. The story begins not in distant lands but in Venice, a city unlike any other in medieval Europe. This was the Venice of 1254, a city built impossibly upon water, where canals served as streets and gondolas as carriages, where the sound of lapping waves mixed with the calls of merchants hawking their wares, where the smell of salt water mingled with exotic spices from distant shores. Marco Polo was born into this world around 1254, though the exact date remains lost to history. His birth came at a time when Venice was reaching the height of its power, when the Republic of Venice controlled trade routes that stretched across the Mediterranean and into the Black Sea, when Venetian merchant ships carried goods from Constantinople to London, from Alexandria to the shores of England. The Polo family were merchants, but not just any merchants. They were members of Venice's merchant elite, families who had built their fortunes through shrewd trading, careful navigation of political currents, and a willingness to venture further than others dared. Marco's grandfather had established the family's reputation, building connections across the Mediterranean world, learning the languages of trade, understanding the complex web of relationships that made commerce possible in an age when a handshake could be worth more than any written contract. Venice itself was a marvel of human ingenuity and ambition. Built upon 118 islands in a shallow lagoon, the city had no streets in the traditional sense. Instead, canals wound between buildings, their waters sometimes green with algae, sometimes reflecting the golden light of sunset, sometimes dark and mysterious in the hours before dawn. The Grand Canal, the main artery of the city, curved through Venice like a reversed letter S, lined with the palaces of wealthy merchant families, each one competing to display their prosperity through elaborate facades decorated with Byzantine mosaics, Gothic arches, and Eastern flourishes that spoke of distant trade connections. The Rialto Bridge, still wooden in Marco's youth, though it would later be rebuilt in the stone arch that survives today, connected the two sides of the Grand Canal where the commercial heart of Venice pulsed with activity. Here, merchants gathered every day to conduct business, to exchange news, to negotiate deals that might involve goods that would not arrive for months, ships that had not yet been built, markets that existed only as rumors carried by travelers from the east. Young Marco grew up surrounded by this world of commerce and maritime power. His father, Niccolo Polo, was often away on trading ventures, sometimes for years at a time. His uncle Maffeo accompanied Niccolo on these journeys, the two brothers forming a partnership that would eventually take them further than any Venetian merchants had traveled before. Marco's mother remains a shadow in history, her name not recorded, her life known only through the fact that she raised Marco during his father's long absence and died before Niccolo returned from his first journey to the east. Education for a merchant's son in 13th century Venice was practical and thorough. Marco would have learned to read and write, essential skills that separated the educated merchant from the mere shopkeeper. Reading meant access to contracts, to letters of credit, to the merchant manuals that contained crucial information about foreign markets, exchange rates, and the quality standards for various goods. Writing allowed a merchant to maintain records, to send instructions to agents in distant cities, to document transactions in ways that would be recognized in courts of law. But literacy was only the beginning. Mathematics formed the foundation of every merchant's education. Marco would have learned arithmetic, not just simple addition and subtraction, but the complex calculations needed to determine profit margins when buying and selling involved multiple currencies, each with different values, each subject to fluctuation based on the purity of the metal they contained. He would have studied geometry, useful for calculating the capacity of ship holds and storage warehouses. He would have learned the merchant's secret weapon, double-entry bookkeeping, a system that the Italians had perfected and that allowed detailed tracking of credits and debits, assets and liabilities. Languages were perhaps the most valuable skill of all. Venice's position as a trading hub meant that dozens of languages could be heard in its markets and harbor. Marco would have learned Latin, the universal language of educated Europeans, used by the church and in diplomatic correspondence. He likely learned Greek, essential for dealing with Byzantine merchants and officials. He probably picked up some Arabic, the language of many Muslim traders who controlled key routes through the Middle East. And he would have learned Venetian dialect, a variant of Italian that served as the language of Mediterranean commerce, understood from one end of the sea to the other. Beyond these formal studies, Marco learned by observation and experience. He watched skilled negotiators at work in the Rialto, noting how they read the subtle signals in a counterpart's face or posture, how they knew when to push for a better price and when to accept what was offered, how they built relationships over time, understanding that a fair deal today might lead to more profitable opportunities tomorrow. He observed how his family assessed the quality of goods, how they could tell fine silk from coarse by touch, how they could judge the purity of spices by smell, how they recognized the subtle differences between genuine gemstones and clever fakes. Marco also learned about risk. Venetian merchants were, in essence, venture capitalists. They invested in voyages that might return enormous profits or might end in disaster. Ships could sink in storms, cargo could spoil, pirates could seize vessels and hold crews for ransom, foreign rulers could confiscate goods on any pretext. The successful merchant learned to spread risk, investing in multiple ventures, never putting all resources into a single ship or market, building networks of partners and agents who could be trusted to handle business honestly even when separated by months of travel time and with no effective way to monitor their activities. The physical city of Marco's childhood was a place of stark contrasts. The wealth of the merchant elite was on display in palaces that fronted the Grand Canal, buildings that incorporated precious materials brought from across the known world. Byzantine mosaics glittered with gold leaf on the walls of St. Mark's Basilica, the city's cathedral, which Venetians had filled with treasures looted from Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade a half-century earlier. For bronze horses, ancient works of Greek or Roman art stood above the entrance to the basilica, symbols of Venice's willingness to take what it wanted and its ability to hold onto its gains. But Venice was not just palaces and churches. Narrow calli, the pedestrian streets that wound between buildings, were often dark and cramped, barely wide enough for two people to pass. These alleys could be dangerous at night, places where robberies occurred, where bodies sometimes turned up floating in canals at dawn, victims of violence whose perpetrators would never be found. The city had a sophisticated government, but it also had crime, poverty, and social tensions that occasionally erupted into violence. The government of Venice was unique in medieval Europe. Unlike kingdoms ruled by hereditary monarchs or city-states controlled by a single powerful family, Venice was an oligarchic republic. The Doge, the elected leader, held the position for life but was constrained by councils and committees that prevented any single person from accumulating too much power. The Great Council, eventually numbering over 1,000 members, was restricted to families listed in the Golden Book, the registry of Venetian nobility. These noble families competed for influence and office, but they also cooperated to maintain the system that protected their collective interests. Politics and commerce were inseparable in Venice. The government regulated trade, deciding which ships could sail and when, setting tariffs on imports and exports, negotiating commercial treaties with foreign powers. Wealthy merchants bid for the privilege of farming taxes, paying the government a fixed sum upfront for the right to collect certain duties, then keeping any amount they collected above that sum. These arrangements could be enormously profitable but also risky, and fortunes could be made or lost based on fluctuations in trade volume. Religion permeated daily life in ways that modern secular societies find difficult to imagine. The bells of Venice's many churches marked the hours, calling the faithful to prayer, announcing births and deaths, warning of fires or other emergencies. The calendar was structured around religious festivals, each one celebrated with processions, special masses, and often commercial fairs that drew merchants from across the region. The church's influence extended into commerce as well. Canon law prohibited usury, the charging of interest on loans, which the church considered sinful. But commerce required credit, so Venetian merchants developed sophisticated workarounds, disguising interest as exchange rate differentials or as payments for the risk involved in maritime ventures. Marco's childhood took place against the backdrop of larger historical currents that would shape his eventual journey. In the 1240s and 1250s, the Mongol Empire was in the midst of its expansion. Genghis Khan, who had united the Mongol tribes and launched their conquests, had died in 1227, but his descendants continued the expansion. By the time of Marco's birth, Mongol armies had conquered northern China, Central Asia, Persia, and parts of Eastern Europe. They had besieged Vienna, raided Poland and Hungary, and seemed poised to continue their march into Western Europe. But then the Mongol expansion in Europe halted. The death of the great Khan Ojide in 1241 led to a succession crisis, and the Mongol commanders in Europe withdrew eastward to participate in choosing the next Khan. They never returned to conquer Europe, though the threat remained in European consciousness for decades. What Europeans didn't fully understand was that the Mongol Empire was beginning to fragment. While nominally united under the Great Khan, the empire was actually dividing into separate khanates, each controlled by different branches of Genghis Khan's family, each increasingly independent in practice. This fragmentation, paradoxically, created opportunities for long-distance trade. The Mongols, whatever their reputation for brutal conquest, understood the value of commerce. They protected merchants traveling through their territories, established relay stations for messengers and travelers, and maintained order along the routes that connected east and west. The period that historians call the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, made long-distance overland travel safer than it had been for centuries. For ambitious Venetian merchants like Niccolo and Maffeo Polo, this represented an unprecedented opportunity. The two Polo brothers had departed Venice in 1260 on what was initially intended as a fairly routine trading voyage. They traveled to Constantinople, then across the Black Sea to the Crimea, where Venetian merchants had established trading posts. From there, seeking new markets and higher profits, they ventured deeper into Mongol-controlled territory. The details of their first journey are sparse, known only through brief mentions in Marco's later account, but the route took them through Central Asia to the court of the Great Khan himself. They arrived at Kublai Khan's court in 1266, after traveling for 6 years. Kublai, grandson of Genghis Khan and by this time the most powerful of the Mongol rulers, received them with interest. He questioned them extensively about Europe, about Christianity, about the Pope and European monarchs. Kublai was known for his curiosity about different cultures and religions. His court included advisors from many backgrounds: Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Taoists, and he listened to them all while committing fully to none. When Niccolo and Maffeo finally departed to return to Venice, Kublai sent messages with them. He requested that the Pope send 100 learned men to his court, scholars who could teach Christianity and the arts and sciences of Europe. He gave the Polos a golden paisa, a tablet inscribed with imperial authorization that would command respect and cooperation from officials throughout the Mongol Empire. And perhaps most importantly for the Polos, he gave them permission to return, implicitly promising that they would be welcomed and perhaps entrusted with opportunities for profitable trade. The journey back took 3 years. When Niccolo finally returned to Venice in 1269, Marco was 15 years old. For the boy, it must have been a strange experience. His father had left when Marco was an infant, perhaps too young to have any memories of him. Marco's mother had died during Niccolo's absence, leaving the boy to be raised by other relatives. Now this traveler appeared, claiming to be his father, bringing tales of land so far away that Marco might have thought them purely legendary. But Niccolo and Maffeo had brought more than tales. They carried goods from the east, valuable items that proved they had indeed traveled to extraordinary places. They showed the golden paisa, an object unlike anything made in Venice, inscribed with script that no Venetian could read. They spoke of the great Khan, of his immense power, of China's vast cities, of customs and technologies unknown in Europe. And they spoke of their plans to return, this time as ambassadors of sorts, carrying the Pope's response to Kublai Khan's request. For Marco, the decision to join his father and uncle on this next journey must have been both thrilling and terrifying. He was still essentially a boy, 17 years old when they departed in 1271, not yet fully grown, with no experience of travel beyond perhaps short voyages in the Mediterranean. Yet he had been trained as a merchant, he was intelligent and adaptable, and he may have felt that this journey offered opportunities that staying in Venice never could. Perhaps Niccolo wanted to bond with the son he barely knew. Perhaps Marco simply wanted to prove himself. Whatever the reasons, when the 3 Polos set out in 1271, Marco went with them. The preparations for such a journey were extensive and complex. The Polos needed to secure financing, probably by borrowing against their property in Venice or by forming partnerships with other merchants who would supply goods for trade in exchange for a share of the profits. They needed to purchase trade goods that would be valuable in the East, things that were common in Europe but rare in Asia, or items that could be sold along the route to fund the next leg of the journey. They had to arrange their affairs in Venice, ensuring that their property would be managed during what would clearly be a journey of years, perhaps even a decade or more. They needed to write wills, to establish powers of attorney for representatives who could handle legal matters in their absence, to settle any outstanding debts or claims. These arrangements were crucial because travel in the 13th century was uncertain in ways that modern people find hard to grasp. There was every chance that they might not return at all. The Polos also needed to obtain the Christian missionaries that Kublai Khan had requested. But finding religious men willing to make such a journey proved nearly impossible. Eventually, 2 Dominican friars volunteered, but as events would show, their commitment was not strong enough to carry them through the hardships ahead. The Polos also obtained letters from Teobaldo Visconti, the papal legate, and sacred oil from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, items they could present to Kublai Khan as gifts from Christendom. The actual departure from Venice in 1271 marked the beginning of a journey that would last 24 years, encompass perhaps 15,000 miles, and take the Polos to places no other Europeans of their time had visited. For Marco, leaving Venice meant leaving behind everything he had ever known. He left the watery streets and familiar sounds of Venetian dialect. He left the site of St. Mark's Basilica and the Doge's Palace. He left the smell of the sea and the calls of gondoliers. He left friends, relatives, perhaps a sweetheart, though history has not recorded such details. He left as a Venetian youth, and he would return, if he returned at all, as something else entirely, someone who had seen the edges of the known world. The journey began with the familiar, a sea voyage across the Mediterranean to the port of Acre, on the coast of what is now Israel. Acre in 1271 was one of the last Crusader strongholds in the Holy Land, a fortified city controlled by European Christians but surrounded by Muslim territories and under constant threat. The Crusades had been underway for nearly 200 years by this point, and the early enthusiasm had long since faded. The Crusader kingdoms that had once stretched from the borders of Egypt to southern Turkey had been reduced to a few coastal cities. Acre itself would fall to the Muslims in 1291, marking the effective end of the Crusader presence in the Levant. The city was a microcosm of Mediterranean commerce and conflict. Different Italian city-states, Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, each controlled their own quarters, complete with churches, warehouses, and fortifications. These quarters were effectively independent territories, where Italian law prevailed and where the respective city-states competed economically and sometimes militarily. The military orders, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, maintained their own compounds, fortified places from which they could defend the city and launch raids into Muslim territory. Acre was also remarkably cosmopolitan. Merchants from across Europe mixed with local Christians, both Catholic and Orthodox. Muslim merchants came to trade despite the religious divisions. Pilgrims arrived constantly, some heading inland to visit Jerusalem and other sacred sites, others just beginning their journey home after completing their pilgrimage. The streets echoed with a babel of languages, Italian dialects, French, German, Arabic, Armenian, Greek, and others. The market sold goods from 3 continents, European woolens and metalwork, Asian spices and silk, African ivory and gold. The Polo spent time in Acre waiting for approval from Rome for their mission. They met with Teobaldo Visconti, the papal legate, seeking his support and authorization. Then news arrived that further delayed their departure. Pope Clement IV had died, and the cardinals were deadlocked in choosing his successor. The Polos waited, but as months passed and no new pope was elected, they decided they could not delay indefinitely. They would set out with letters from the legate, hoping that by the time they reached Kublai Khan, a new pope would have been chosen and could send formal approval. The 2 Dominican friars accompanied them as they left Acre, heading inland toward the territories controlled by the Mongol Ilkhanate. But the friars' commitment was soon tested. The region was unstable, with the Muslim Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt expanding northward, conquering territory from both the Crusaders and the Mongols. Rumors of war and reports of armies on the move created an atmosphere of danger and uncertainty. For the friars, who had volunteered perhaps more out of religious enthusiasm than practical understanding of what such a journey entailed, this was too much. After a relatively short distance, they turned back, leaving the Polos to continue alone. Marco's real education in the wider world was now beginning. The journey from Acre took them into Armenia, both the Kingdom of Lesser Armenia in Cilicia and the regions of Greater Armenia further inland. Here, Marco encountered Christians who practiced their faith differently from the Roman Catholicism he knew. The Armenian Apostolic Church was one of the oldest Christian traditions, claiming descent from the apostles Bartholomew and Thaddeus, who according to tradition had evangelized Armenia in the 1st century. Armenian Christians had their own liturgy, conducted not in Latin but in Classical Armenian, their own hierarchy independent of Rome, and their own traditions developed over more than 1,000 years. The landscape of Armenia impressed Marco deeply. The region was dominated by mountains, the Lesser Caucasus and the High Armenian Plateau, a terrain of dramatic peaks, deep valleys, and rivers that rushed down rocky courses. In the distance rose Mount Ararat, a massive dormant volcano that, according to biblical tradition, was where Noah's Ark had come to rest after the flood. The mountain's twin peaks, one over 16,000 feet high, dominated the horizon, their summits often shrouded in clouds. For medieval Christians, Ararat was a connection to ancient history, a reminder of the flood narrative that was central to their understanding of human origins. Armenian culture had survived centuries of invasion and foreign rule through a combination of geographical isolation, cultural cohesion, and religious identity. The Armenian language, unlike any of its neighbors, served as a marker of ethnic identity. Armenian literature, particularly religious texts translated from Greek and Syriac in the early centuries of Christianity, preserved knowledge that had been lost elsewhere. Armenian monasteries, often built in remote mountain locations, served as centers of learning and repositories of manuscripts. But Armenia was also a region that had suffered terribly from Mongol conquests. In the 1230s and 1240s, Mongol armies had swept through the region, destroying cities, massacring populations, and bringing the surviving Armenian kingdoms under Mongol suzerainty. By the time the Polos passed through in 1271, Armenia was recovering but remained under Mongol control, paying tribute to the Ilkhan who ruled Persia. The Polos would have seen ruined fortifications, depopulated villages, and heard stories of the devastation that had occurred a generation earlier. From Armenia, the Polos traveled southeast into Persia, entering the territories of the Ilkhanate. Persia in the 13th century was a land of ancient civilization recovering from catastrophic invasion. The Mongol conquest of Persia, led by Kublai Khan, a grandson of Genghis, had been particularly brutal. Cities that resisted were destroyed completely, their populations killed or enslaved. The irrigation systems that had sustained Persian agriculture for millennia were destroyed, and many regions never fully recovered. Historians estimate that Persia's population declined by as much as 75% in the half-century of Mongol conquest and subsequent instability. Yet Persia retained its cultural sophistication and its strategic importance. This was the land that had given birth to the Achaemenid Empire of Cyrus and Darius, the Parthian and Sasanian empires that had rivaled Rome, the Islamic Golden Age when Baghdad had been the center of world learning. Persian remained the language of culture and administration across much of Central Asia and northern India. Persian poetry, architecture, and art influenced cultures from the Mediterranean to China. The route the Polos took through Persia is not entirely clear from Marco's account, which was written years later and may conflate or confuse the order of places visited. But they clearly traveled across the Iranian plateau, a high desert rimmed by mountain ranges. The Zagros Mountains to the west separate the plateau from Mesopotamia. The Elburz Mountains to the north rise up to peaks over 18,000 feet high, creating a barrier between the plateau and the Caspian Sea. To the east and south, other ranges mark the transitions to Afghanistan and the Persian Gulf. Traveling across this plateau meant adapting to a harsh environment. The central plateau is largely desert or semi-desert, with extremes of temperature between scorching summer days and cold winter nights. Annual rainfall is low, and water sources are scattered and often unreliable. Persian engineers had developed sophisticated solutions to these challenges, most notably the qanats, underground water channels that tapped into groundwater in the mountains and carried it for miles through tunnels to irrigate fields and supply cities. These ancient systems, some dating back thousands of years, allowed agriculture in regions that would otherwise be too dry to support intensive cultivation. The cities of Persia, even in their reduced state after the Mongol invasions, impressed Marco. He described Kerman, a city in southeastern Persia known for its fine textiles and turquoise mining. The city's craftsmen produced embroidered fabrics that were highly valued in trade, and the turquoise from nearby mines was considered among the finest in the world, stones of pure blue color without the greenish tint that marked inferior quality. Marco noted these details with a merchant's eye, always assessing what goods were available, what their quality was, what they might fetch in other markets. He described Yazd, another Persian city that had somehow survived the Mongol invasions relatively intact, perhaps because it surrendered quickly and paid tribute. Yazd was known for silk weaving, and Marco noted the quality of its products. The city was also a center of Zoroastrianism, the ancient Persian religion that had been the state faith of the Sasanian Empire before Islam's arrival in the 7th century. Zoroastrians, who worshipped Ahura Mazda and maintained sacred fires in their temples, had persisted as a minority community under Muslim rule. Marco observed their practices with interest, describing fire temples and noting customs he didn't fully understand but recognized as important to the people who practiced them. The journey through Persia was not without danger. Bandits operated in remote areas, preying on caravans. Local conflicts between different Mongol factions or between Mongol officials and local populations could suddenly make a region unsafe. The Polos relied on guides who knew the terrain and could navigate not just the physical landscape but the political one, understanding which routes were currently safe, which officials needed to be paid off, which caravanserais offered genuine security versus which were actually bases for thieves. Caravanserais were essential infrastructure for Silk Road trade. These fortified inns, built at intervals along major routes, provided shelter, food, water, and security for travelers and their animals. The layout of a typical caravanserai was functional and practical. A high wall surrounded a central courtyard where pack animals could be secured. A single strong gate, which could be barred at night, was the only entrance. Around the courtyard were rooms where travelers could sleep, storage areas for goods, and sometimes a mosque or chapel. Some caravanserais were simple structures, offering only basic shelter. Others, particularly in major cities or at crucial crossroads, were elaborate complexes with their own bazaars, bathhouses, and accommodations for wealthy merchants that rivaled city hotels. The social world of the caravanserai was its own distinct culture. Here, merchants from different regions and backgrounds mixed, sharing meals, exchanging information, sometimes forming partnerships for the next leg of their journey. Stories were told, rumors evaluated, prices compared. A merchant might learn that the ruler of a city ahead was imposing new taxes, or that a rival caravan had been robbed, or that a particular commodity was in short supply in a certain market. This information was valuable, sometimes more valuable than the physical goods being traded, because it allowed merchants to adjust their plans, to change routes or destinations, to buy or sell based on anticipated conditions. Marco was learning the skills that would serve him well in the years ahead. He was learning languages, picking up Persian and perhaps some Turkic, adding to his Italian, Latin, and the other languages he already knew. He was learning to assess people quickly, to judge who could be trusted and who could not, to recognize the subtle signals that indicated danger or opportunity. He was learning to endure physical hardship, long days of travel in harsh conditions, simple food, uncomfortable sleeping arrangements, the constant low-level stress of being far from home in unfamiliar territory. The Polos had initially planned to take ship from the Persian Gulf port of Hormuz to continue their journey eastward by sea. Hormuz was one of the great trading cities of the medieval world, located on an island in the strait that controlled access to the Persian Gulf. The city was hot and humid, sitting in a region where summer temperatures could exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and the humidity made it feel even hotter. Water had to be brought from the mainland, making it expensive. Yet despite these disadvantages, Hormuz thrived because of its strategic location. Ships came to Hormuz from India, Arabia, and East Africa. They brought spices from the Malabar coast of India, black pepper, ginger, cinnamon, nutmeg, goods that were literally worth their weight in gold in European markets. They brought textiles, fine cotton muslins from India that were so light they seemed to float. They brought precious stones, rubies from Sri Lanka, pearls from the Gulf. In exchange, they took away Persian carpets, horses from Central Asia, metalwork, and goods from further west that had made their way through Persia. The ships themselves fascinated Marco. They were different from European vessels, constructed using techniques developed over centuries of Indian Ocean seafaring. Many were built without iron nails, instead sewn together with coir rope made from coconut fibers. The planks were drilled with holes and lashed together, creating a flexible structure that could survive the stresses of ocean waves better than a rigid nailed hull. To European eyes, these ships looked fragile, and the thought of entrusting one's life to a vessel held together with rope seemed madness. Marco's account describes these ships and expresses doubts about their seaworthiness. Whether this was his real concern or whether there were other reasons, the Polos decided not to take ship from Hormuz. Perhaps they received disturbing news about conditions in India or about piracy in the Arabian Sea. Perhaps they learned that the monsoon winds, which govern sailing seasons in the Indian Ocean, would force them to wait months for favorable conditions. Whatever the reason, they turned back north from Hormuz, committing themselves to the overland route through Central Asia. This decision meant they would have to cross some of the most challenging terrain on Earth, the mountains of Afghanistan, the high Pamir Plateau, and eventually the deserts of Central Asia. From the lowlands near Hormuz, they traveled north and then east, ascending into the mountains of what is now Afghanistan and neighboring regions. The landscape became increasingly rugged, valleys growing narrower and deeper, peaks rising higher, the air growing thinner. Afghanistan is where empires go to die, or so modern military strategists sometimes say, and the region's history bears this out. Every major empire that has sought to control Central Asia has had to contend with Afghanistan's geography and the fierce independence of its peoples. The Hindu Kush Mountains, whose name has been translated as either Hindu Killer or Hindu Mountains depending on interpretation, form a massive barrier between the Indian subcontinent and Central Asia. The passes through these mountains reach extreme altitudes, often over 12,000 or even 15,000 feet above sea level, and are closed by snow for much of the year. The Polo's route took them through these mountains, a journey that required different skills and equipment than the desert crossing they had experienced in Persia. Instead of heat, they faced cold. Instead of worrying about water scarcity, they dealt with freezing rivers and snow. The air at high altitude made even simple tasks exhausting. Breath came short, hearts pounded, and altitude sickness was a real danger, manifesting as headaches, nausea, and in extreme cases, fluid buildup in lungs or brain that could be fatal if not treated by rapid descent to lower elevations. Marco's account describes spending time in the mountain valleys, recovering from an illness that may have been related to the altitude or may have been one of the many diseases that could strike travelers. He mentions that the mountain air was believed to have curative properties, and he stayed in the high valleys to regain his strength before continuing. This may have been in the Wakhan Corridor, a narrow strip of territory that connects Afghanistan to China, or in the high valleys south of the Pamirs. Wherever it was, the experience left an impression on Marco, who noted the distinctive characteristics of the place. One observation Marco recorded was the wild sheep of the mountains, animals with massive curved horns that lived at extreme altitudes where few other large mammals could survive. These sheep, later named Ovis Polly in Marco's honor, were and are found in the high Pamir Mountains. The males grow spectacular horns that can reach 5 feet in length and weigh 50 pounds or more. Marco Polo sheep are adapted to life at altitudes above 12,000 feet, where oxygen is scarce, temperatures are extreme, and vegetation is sparse. They survive by feeding on the tough grasses and sedges that grow in sheltered valleys, moving seasonally to find food and avoid the worst of the winter weather. Marco also described the people living in these mountain regions. They were ethnically diverse, speaking different languages, practicing different forms of Islam or Buddhism or older religious traditions that predated both. Some were settled farmers, cultivating barley and other crops that could grow in short mountain summers and herding sheep and goats. Others were more nomadic, moving with their herds to high summer pastures and wintering in protected valleys. They lived in houses built of stone with flat roofs covered in earth, structures that could withstand the weight of winter snow. In colder months or at higher elevations, they used felt tents, shelters that could be assembled and disassembled as needed. These mountain people served crucial roles in Silk Road trade despite their isolation. They knew the passes, the trails that were navigable, and when, the places where water could be found, the villages that welcomed travelers versus those that viewed outsiders with suspicion. They worked as guides and porters, and caravans traveling through the mountains depended on their knowledge and cooperation. In return, they received goods from the passing trade, metal tools, cloth, salt, and other items that were difficult to produce in the mountains. After the mountains of Afghanistan came the Pamirs, a high plateau that extends across parts of Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Kyrgyzstan, and China. Marco called this region the roof of the world, a description that captures its essential nature. The Pamir Plateau sits at an average elevation of 13,000 to 15,000 feet above sea level, with peaks rising much higher. It is a land of rolling grasslands punctuated by higher mountains, of rivers fed by glacier flowing through wide valleys, of a sky that seems impossibly vast and close. The Pamirs are cold, even in summer. Winter temperatures can reach -40 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. The growing season is brief, and agriculture is limited to the lowest valleys. Yet the plateau has supported human life for thousands of years, home to nomadic peoples who herd yaks, sheep, and horses across the high pastures. These nomads lived, and some still live, in yurts, circular tents with walls of felt wrapped around a collapsible wooden frame, topped with a conical roof that has an opening to let smoke from the central hearth escape. Marco's observations of the Pamir region show his continued curiosity about the natural world. He noted that fire burned differently at high altitude, with flames that were less bright and less hot than at sea level. This observation is accurate. The lower oxygen content and reduced air pressure at high altitude affect combustion, making it harder to start fires and causing them to burn less vigorously. He commented that food took longer to cook, which is also true. The lower boiling point of water at high altitude means that water boils at a lower temperature, slowing the cooking process. More surprisingly, Marco reported that wounds healed more quickly in the mountain air. This claim is harder to evaluate. It's possible that the dry air and intense ultraviolet radiation at high altitude had some antiseptic effect, or that the cold reduced swelling and infection rates. Or it might simply have been that the Polos happened to recover well from injuries sustained in the mountains and attributed their recovery to the environment. Medieval understanding of medicine was often based on such observations, accurate or not, and theories about the effects of different airs and climate on health were common. From the Pamirs, the route descended gradually toward the Tarim Basin, a vast depression in what is now western China, surrounded by some of the highest mountain ranges on Earth. To the north lie the Tian Shan Mountains. To the south and west rise the Pamirs and Karakoram. To the southwest are the Kunlun Mountains. This ring of mountains creates a vast enclosed basin where precipitation is scarce and rivers flowing down from the mountains vanish into the desert or into salt lakes that have no outlet to the sea. The Tarim Basin contains one of Earth's most forbidding environments, the Taklamakan Desert. The desert covers over 100,000 square miles, an expanse of sand dunes, some reaching over 300 feet high, interspersed with areas of gravel and bare rock. The name Taklamakan has been translated variously, but one common interpretation is "go in and you won't come out," a stark warning of the desert's dangers. Temperatures swing wildly between day and night, summer and winter. Sandstorms can reduce visibility to zero and last for days. Water sources are virtually non-existent in the desert interior. But the Silk Road did not cross the Taklamakan directly. Instead, it followed the oases that ring the desert's edges, a chain of cities and towns sustained by rivers flowing down from the surrounding mountains. These oases are strung along the northern and southern edges of the Tarim Basin like pearls on a necklace, each one an island of green in a sea of sand and rock, each one a crucial stopping point where caravans could rest, resupply, and trade. Kasha was the first major oasis city the Polos reached after descending from the Pamirs. The city occupied a strategic position at the western edge of the Tarim Basin, where routes from the south through the Karakoram and routes from the west through the Pamirs converged before continuing east into China proper. Kasha had been a stopping point on the Silk Road for over 1,000 years by the time the Polos arrived. It had been ruled by Chinese dynasties, Tibetan empires, Turkic Khanates, and others, each leaving their mark on the city's culture and appearance. By the 13th century, Kasha was predominantly Muslim, and its population was primarily Turkic-speaking, though the city showed influences from the many cultures that had passed through or ruled it. The city was known for its gardens and vineyards, taking advantage of the irrigation systems that brought water from nearby mountains. The produce of these gardens, fruits, vegetables, and wine made from local grapes, was welcome after the sparse diet available in the high Pamirs. But Kasha's real importance was commercial. The city's famous bazaar, which still operates today, was where merchants from China, Central Asia, India, and the Middle East met to exchange goods. Silk from China met wool from Central Asia. Tea and porcelain could be traded for horses and precious stones. Spices from the south were exchanged for manufactured goods from the east. The bazaar was a sensory overload, with the cries of merchants in a dozen languages, the smell of spices and roasting meat, the sight of carpets and textiles in every color, the sound of silver being tested and weighed. The Polos would have conducted business in Kasha, selling goods they had carried from the west and purchasing items they could sell further east. They would have gathered information about the route ahead, about conditions in China, about the state of Kublai Khan's conquest of southern China, which was still ongoing. They would have rested, allowing their animals to recover and themselves to adjust to the lower elevation after the high Pamirs. From Kasha, the route continued east along the southern or northern edges of the Taklamakan Desert. The southern route passed through cities like Yarkand and Khotan. The northern route went through Aksu and Kucha. Both routes eventually converged at the eastern end of the Tarim Basin, near the oasis of Dunrawang. Marco's account is not entirely clear about which route the Polos took, and it's possible they split up temporarily, exploring different routes before reuniting, a common practice for merchant families seeking to maximize their knowledge of markets and opportunities. Each of the oasis cities had its own character and economy. Yarkand was known for jade, the precious stone that the Chinese valued above all others, which was found in the rivers flowing down from the mountains. Khotan had been a center of Buddhism for centuries, though by Marco's time Islam was becoming dominant. The city was famous for silk production, carpets, and as a source of jade as well. Aksu and Kucha had been important Buddhist centers in earlier times, with cave temples and monasteries, though these were declining as Islam spread through the region. The journey along these oasis routes required patience and careful planning. The distance between oases could be several days' travel, sometimes a week or more, and caravans had to carry enough water and supplies to reach the next settlement. The routes themselves varied with the seasons, as rivers changed course, as oases expanded or contracted depending on water availability, as political conditions made certain routes more or less safe. Marco's account describes the goods and customs of each city, noting the types of crafts produced, the religious practices of the inhabitants, the quality of local products. He observed that cotton cloth was widely produced and used for clothing, that the people followed Islamic dietary laws, abstaining from pork and wine, that they had their own systems of law and governance even under Mongol overlordship. These observations show Marco's attention to detail and his merchants' interest in understanding the markets and peoples he encountered. As the Polos traveled east along the Tarim Basin, they were tracing a route that had been used for over a millennium. Buddhist monks had traveled west along these routes between the 2nd and 8th centuries, carrying scriptures from India to China and bringing Chinese pilgrims to Buddhism's holy sites in India. The famous monk Xuanzang, whose 7th century journey inspired the classic Chinese novel The Journey to the West, had passed through many of these same cities. His detailed account of the region from that earlier time provides a comparison point that shows how much had changed and how much had remained the same over the intervening centuries. The cities of the Tarim Basin preserved this religious history in their art and architecture, even as Islam gradually became the dominant faith. Cave temples carved into cliff faces contain Buddhist murals and statues, some well-maintained, others abandoned and slowly deteriorating. These caves were repositories of religious art that showed influences from India, Persia, and China, creating styles unique to Central Asia. Later archaeological expeditions would discover manuscripts in the caves, religious texts in Sanskrit, Chinese, Sogdian, and other languages, some of them preserving works that had been lost elsewhere. The Polos finally reached Dunhuang, the last major oasis before the Gobi Desert crossing. Dunhuang had been one of the most important cities on the Silk Road for over 1,000 years. It was here that the northern and southern routes around the Taklamakan rejoined, and where caravans prepared for the crossing of the Gobi Desert that lay ahead. The city was famous for the Mogaro Caves, also known as the Caves of the Thousand Buddhas, a complex of nearly 500 cave temples carved into cliff faces over the course of 1,000 years. The Mogaro Caves were a wonder of religious art and devotion. The caves varied from small chambers that might hold only a few people to massive halls that could accommodate hundreds. They were decorated with murals depicting the life of Buddha, scenes from Buddhist scriptures, portraits of donors who had funded the cave's creation, and representations of the heavens and hells described in Buddhist cosmology. The murals showed the evolution of Buddhist art over centuries, incorporating influences from India, Persia, and China into styles that were distinctly Central Asian. Marco's account mentions the religious sites of Dunhuang, though without the detail that modern art historians would wish for. The Polos were not particularly interested in Buddhism as a religion, viewing it through the lens of their Catholic Christianity, often misunderstanding or misinterpreting what they saw. But they recognized the importance of the caves and the devotion they represented, and Marco's account conveys a sense of awe at the scale and beauty of what he witnessed. Dunhuang was also where the Polos would have made final preparations for crossing the Gobi Desert. This was a more serious challenge than anything they had yet faced. The Gobi is vast, over 500,000 square miles stretching across southern Mongolia and northern China. It is not a single uniform desert but a complex of different landscapes, gravel plains called Gobi in Mongolian, rocky plateaus, scattered sand dunes, and seasonal rivers that flow during brief rainy periods and then disappear into the parched earth. The Gobi is a cold desert, different from the hot deserts of the Middle East or North Africa. Winter temperatures can plunge to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Summer days can reach over 100 degrees, but nights are cool even in summer. Precipitation is scarce, averaging only about 7.5 inches per year, and in some areas even less. The desert is subject to fierce dust storms and sandstorms that can last for days, blotting out the sun and making travel impossible. Crossing the Gobi required careful planning and experienced guidance. The Polos would have hired guides, local Mongols who knew the desert, who understood where water could be found, which routes were passable at different seasons, how to navigate when landmarks were few and the landscape seemed to repeat endlessly. They would have acquired additional camels, the Bactrian two-humped camels that were native to Central Asia and perfectly adapted to desert conditions. These camels could carry heavy loads, could go for days without water, and could survive on the sparse vegetation that existed in parts of the desert. The caravan would have stocked up on supplies, dried meat, dried fruit, grain for making bread or porridge, and most critically, water. Water was carried in leather bags that, despite their tendency to leak slowly, were the best containers available. The amount of water needed for a crossing of 30 or 40 days, for dozens of people and animals, was substantial, and managing water supplies was one of the guide's most important responsibilities. When the Polos finally set out from Dunhuang into the Gobi, they were entering one of Earth's most forbidding environments. The landscape would have revealed itself gradually, the green of the oasis fading, vegetation becoming sparser, the ground changing from cultivated fields to wild grass to bare earth and rock. The horizon stretched endlessly in all directions without features to mark distance or progress. The sky dominated everything, vast and pitiless during the day, spectacular with stars at night. Traveling in the Gobi required developing new rhythms and routines. The caravan would rise before dawn, loading pack animals in the pre-dawn darkness, setting out as the sun rose to make as much progress as possible in the cooler morning hours. They would travel for several hours, then rest during the intense midday heat, seeking whatever shade could be created with tents or blankets. As the afternoon cooled, they would resume traveling, continuing until darkness made further progress dangerous. At night, they would camp, posting guards to watch for bandits or wild animals, and rest fitfully under the cold desert stars. Water discipline was crucial. Each person and animal had an allocated ration, carefully measured and jealously guarded. When the caravan reached a water source, a well or spring, it was a moment of celebration, though the water itself might be brackish or contaminated with minerals, safe to drink but far from refreshing. Desert water sources were often alkaline, with high concentrations of dissolved salts that gave the water an unpleasant taste. But unpleasant water was better than no water, and the caravan would refill every container before moving on. Marco's account describes not just the physical challenges but the psychological ones. He writes of the profound silence of the desert, a quiet so complete that it seemed to press against the ears, making the small sounds of the caravan, the footfalls of camels, the creak of leather, the occasional cough or murmur of conversation, seem abnormally loud. He describes mirages, visions of cities and lakes that appeared on the horizon, shimmering in the heat, only to vanish as the caravan approached. These optical illusions, caused by light refraction through layers of air at different temperatures, could be disconcerting or even dangerous if they led travelers off the correct path. Most strikingly, Marco describes strange sounds heard at night, which he attributes to spirits or demons. He tells of voices calling travelers' names, of music or singing heard in the darkness, of sounds that seemed to come from empty desert when no one was there. Medieval travelers interpreted these phenomena as supernatural, but modern explanations point to natural causes. Wind moving through rock formations can create eerie sounds. Temperature changes cause rocks to crack and shift, producing noises like thunder or drum beats. The human brain, stressed by isolation and hardship, can produce auditory hallucinations, hearing patterns in random noise. But whatever the cause, these sounds added to the sense that the desert was a place of danger, where the normal rules did not apply. The belief in desert spirits was widespread across Central Asia. Chinese, Turkic, and Mongol peoples all had traditions of supernatural beings that inhabited the wilderness. Stories told of jinn, spirits that could take various forms, that could lead travelers astray or help them depending on the spirit's whims. Whether the Polos believed these stories or not, they respected them. In an environment where a wrong turn could be fatal, where missing a water source by a few hundred yards could mean death, caution was essential. The desert was not entirely empty. Occasionally, the caravan would pass ruins, the remains of cities, forts, or way station from earlier times, slowly being reclaimed by the sand. These ruins were reminders that the Silk Road had been in use for over a millennium, that many caravans had passed this way before, and that not all of them had succeeded. Sometimes they would encounter other caravans, meetings in the vastness that provided opportunities to exchange news and information. Very rarely, they might see wildlife, wild asses, gazelles, or foxes that had adapted to the desert's extreme conditions. The nights in the Gobi must have been extraordinary. With no artificial light for hundreds of miles, no cities or towns to create light pollution, the stars would have been brilliant beyond anything visible in modern times. The Milky Way would have stretched across the sky like a river of light. The planets would have shone like beacons. Shooting stars, meteor trails burning up in the atmosphere, would have been frequent. For Marco, raised in Venice where buildings blocked much of the sky, this immense celestial display must have been awe-inspiring, a reminder of how small human concern seemed when set against the vastness of the universe. As the days of crossing accumulated, the routine became both familiar and wearing. Each day looked much like the one before, the same landscape, the same routine, the same plodding progress. The monotony could be numbing, and travelers had to fight against the mental fatigue that came with endless repetition. Conversation helped, stories told and retold, memories shared, speculation about what lay ahead. The bonds formed on such a journey ran deep, forged in shared hardship and mutual dependence. And then, gradually, the far edge of the desert began to approach. The landscape changed subtly at first, a little more vegetation, slightly different colors in the soil, a sense that water was more available even if it wasn't immediately visible. The pace of the caravan might have quickened, anticipation building. And eventually, they would sight the signs of the next oasis or settlement, the signal that this phase of the journey was complete. When the Polos finally emerged from the Gobi Desert, they had accomplished something remarkable. They had crossed one of the world's most forbidding environments, a desert that had defeated many others. The crossing had probably taken 30 to 40 days or more, a month or more of daily struggle against heat, cold, thirst, and the psychological weight of the desert's vastness. But they had survived. They had proven their determination and capability. The transformation the journey had worked on them, especially on young Marco, was profound. He had left Venice as a sheltered merchant's son, his world bounded by the canals and markets of that single city, his understanding of geography limited to maps that showed Europe, the Mediterranean, and vague, often fanciful representations of lands beyond. Now he stood at the edge of the Mongol Empire's heartland, having traveled further than almost any European of his generation, having seen landscapes and peoples that most of his countrymen would never encounter even in their imaginations. Marco had learned languages along the way, not just the words but the rhythms and patterns of thought that different languages embodied. He could haggle in Persian markets, understand Turkish spoken by Mongol officials, follow conversations in the Sino-Tibetan languages of the borderlands. This linguistic ability would prove invaluable in the years ahead, but it also represented something deeper, an ability to step outside his own cultural assumptions and see the world through different frameworks of understanding. He had learned to read landscapes, to recognize the subtle signs that indicated water or danger, to judge distances in terrain that provided no familiar reference points, to navigate by stars and sun and the patterns of wind and weather. He had developed the physical endurance necessary for long-distance travel, the ability to keep going when exhausted, to function on minimal sleep, to eat unfamiliar foods and drink questionable water without falling ill, to endure extreme temperatures and the constant discomforts of life on the road. But perhaps more importantly, Marco had learned to observe. The account that would eventually bear his name is remarkable not for literary excellence but for the density of its observations. Marco noticed things, the types of goods in each market, the building materials used in different regions, the crops grown and animals raised, the religious practices and social customs, the systems of government and administration. This observational skill, combined with a merchant's practical interest in understanding what made different societies function, would make his eventual account of China valuable despite its limitations and inaccuracies. The journey itself had also taught the Polos about risk management in ways that went beyond commercial calculations. They had learned that careful planning could only do so much, that circumstances changed unpredictably, that survival often depended on adaptability rather than adherence to plans. They had learned to read people quickly, to judge who could be trusted and who could not, to navigate complex social situations where misunderstandings could have serious consequences. They had learned humility, the understanding that their Venetian sophistication meant nothing in contexts where they were the foreigners, the outsiders who needed help and guidance from people they might otherwise have dismissed as primitive or uncivilized. The Gobi crossing marked the end of one phase of the journey and the beginning of another. Behind them lay the Western world, Persia with its ancient civilization, Central Asia with its oasis cities and mountain valleys, the deserts and steppes that separated east from west. Ahead lay China, a civilization as old as any on Earth, a land of huge cities and sophisticated culture, of technologies and social systems that would challenge everything the Polos thought they knew about what constituted advanced civilization. The journey from Venice to the edge of the Gobi had taken perhaps 3 or 4 years. It would take longer still to reach Kublai Khan's court and begin the service that would keep them in China for the next 17 years. But in crossing the Gobi, the Polos had passed a threshold. They had moved from the realm of the possible into what most Europeans would have considered impossible. They had traveled beyond the edges of European geographical knowledge into territory that existed on European maps only as blank space or fantasy. They were about to encounter China, a civilization that medieval Europeans knew about only through the vaguest rumors and the exaggerated tales of merchants who had traded with merchants who had traded with merchants who had actually been there. The Polos would see China directly, would live in it, would participate in its life in ways no other Europeans of their time would match. As they emerged from the desert, entering lands where vegetation grew more abundantly and where the signs of human settlement became more frequent, Marco must have felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief at having survived the desert crossing. Anticipation of finally reaching their destination after years of travel. Perhaps also apprehension, wondering what awaited them in this strange land, whether Kublai Khan would remember the promises made to Niccolo and Maffeo years earlier, whether they would be welcomed or viewed with suspicion. The landscape was changing around them, transforming from the barren desert into the grasslands of Mongolia. These were the steppes, the vast rolling plains that had nurtured the Mongol people and given them the horses and riders that had conquered half the world. Grass grew thick here, fed by rivers flowing down from mountains to the north and by summer rains that, while sporadic, were more generous than anything the desert received. The grass could support enormous herds, and the Polos would have begun to see these herds, thousands of horses, sheep, cattle, and goats, managed by Mongol herders who lived much as their ancestors had for thousands of years. They were now in the heartland of Mongol power, the territories directly controlled by the Great Khan. Everything they had seen so far, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai territories in Central Asia, these were parts of the Mongol Empire ruled by different branches of Genghis Khan's family. But here, they were approaching the center, the court of Kublai Khan, who had claimed the title of Great Khan and who ruled what would become known as the Yuan dynasty in China. The young Marco Polo, still not yet 20 years old, had crossed deserts and mountains that most Europeans had never even heard of. His journey was far from over, but he had already accomplished more than most people of his age could dream of. The education in endurance, observation, and adaptability that would serve him well in the years ahead was complete. Now came the next chapter, the encounter with a civilization that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the world. And in that encounter, Marco would find opportunities that would keep him in the service of the Great Khan for nearly 2 decades, opportunities to travel even further, to see even more, and eventually to carry back to Europe a vision of the East that would shape European understanding for centuries to come. The grasslands of Mongolia revealed themselves slowly, each day bringing subtle changes in the landscape. Where the desert had been barren, now sparse vegetation appeared, tough grasses that could survive harsh winters and brief summers. Where water had been a rare treasure, now streams and rivers flowed more frequently, fed by distant mountains whose snowmelt sustained life across the steppes. And where the land had seemed empty, now the signs of human presence multiplied, tracks of herds and riders, smoke from distant cooking fires, and eventually the sight of shas, the round felt tents that dotted the grasslands. These were the homelands of the Mongol people, the vast steppes that had shaped their culture and given them the skills that enabled their conquests. The Mongols were nomadic pastoralists, their lives built around herding horses, sheep, goats, cattle, and yak. They moved with the seasons, seeking fresh pasture for their animals, following patterns established over generations. Theirs could be assembled and disassembled quickly, the felt walls and roof covering packed onto carts or animals, the wooden frames broken down into manageable pieces, allowing an entire household to move to new grazing lands in a matter of hours. Marco Polo observed these people with the keen attention that characterized all his travels. He noted their clothing, practical garments made from wool and leather, designed to protect against the harsh weather of the steppes. He described their diet, centered on meat and dairy products from their herds, particularly the fermented mare's milk called kumis that was the Mongols' favorite drink. He watched their horsemanship, skills developed from childhood, as Mongol children learned to ride almost as soon as they could walk. He saw how Mongol warriors could ride for days with minimal supplies, how they could shoot arrows accurately from horseback at full gallop, how they could survive on the steppes indefinitely if they had their horses. The political organization of the Mongols was based on kinship and military prowess. Tribes and clans formed the basic units of society, each led by a Khan or chief whose authority depended on his ability to provide for his people and lead them successfully in war. Genghis Khan's great achievement had been to unite these tribes, previously often at war with each other, into a single force that could conquer settled civilizations. The system he established, combining Mongol military traditions with administrative practices borrowed from the Chinese, Persians, and others, had proven remarkably effective. By the time the Polos traveled through Mongolia in the mid-1270s, Genghis Khan had been dead for nearly 50 years, but his legacy shaped everything. His descendants ruled vast territories, from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to the borders of India. They had adopted many of the trappings of the civilizations they conquered, building permanent palaces, establishing bureaucracies, patronizing arts and sciences. Yet they retained their Mongol identity, their pride in their nomadic heritage, their reverence for Genghis Khan's memory. The Polos were traveling with the Paisa, the golden tablet of authority that Kublai Khan had given to Niccolo and Mafia on their previous journey. This Paisa was their passport and protection, a physical manifestation of the Khan's favor that commanded respect and cooperation from officials throughout the empire. The tablets came in different grades, gold for the highest authority, silver for lesser ranks. The inscription on a paisa typically commanded that the bearer be given whatever assistance they required, whether horses, food, lodging, or safe passage. Failure to comply could result in severe punishment, even death, for the offending official. With this authorization, the Polos traveled efficiently through Mongolia, using the Yam system, the network of relay stations that the Mongols had established for rapid communication across their empire. These stations were spaced about 25 miles apart, a day's hard ride, and maintained supplies of fresh horses, food, and lodging for authorized travelers. Imperial messengers using the Yam system could cover over 100 miles in a day by changing horses at each station, allowing messages to travel from one end of the empire to the other in weeks rather than the months it would otherwise require. The route to Shangju, Kublai Khan's summer capital, took the Polos north and then east through Mongolia. The journey gave Marco more time to observe Mongol society and to understand the people whose armies had terrified Europe just a generation earlier. He noted their religious practices, a form of shamanism that involved communication with spirits of nature and ancestors. Shamans held important positions in Mongol society, consulting omens, performing rituals to ensure good fortune, and advising leaders on auspicious times for important decisions. The Mongols also showed remarkable religious tolerance, respecting various faiths, whether Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, or others, a pragmatism that served them well in ruling diverse populations. Marco observed Mongol warfare techniques, though the height of the Mongol conquests was past and the armies he saw were smaller than those that had conquered empires. Mongol military organization was based on the decimal system, with units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 men. Discipline was strict, with commanders responsible for their unit's performance. Tactics emphasized mobility, archery, and psychological warfare. Mongols often used feigned retreats to draw enemy forces into ambushes. They employed scouts extensively to gather intelligence, and they were masters of siege warfare, having learned techniques from Chinese and Persian engineers. But Marco also saw that the Mongol Empire was changing. The descendants of Genghis Khan were becoming less Mongol and more like the peoples they ruled. In Persia, the Ilkhans were adopting Persian culture and would soon convert to Islam. In Russia, the Golden Horde maintained Mongol traditions but was increasingly isolated from other parts of the empire. And Kublai Khan himself, though proud of his Mongol heritage, was deeply influenced by Chinese civilization and was attempting to rule China not as a foreign conqueror but as a legitimate Chinese emperor. After weeks of travel across the steppes, the Polos finally approached Shangju, known to Europeans as Xanadu. The city's appearance on the horizon must have been striking, walls rising from the grasslands, enclosing a complex that was part city, part palace, part hunting preserve. Shangju was Kublai Khan's summer residence, where he spent the warm months of the year before moving to his winter capital, Khanbaliq, today's Beijing. The city had been designed by Chinese architects but incorporated Mongol elements, creating a unique blend that reflected Kublai's dual identity. The walls of Shangju were massive, built of rammed earth in the Chinese style, enclosing an area of nearly 6 square miles. Within these outer walls lay the imperial city, with its own walls and gates. And within the imperial city was the palace complex itself, where Kublai Khan held court and lived with his family and closest associates. But what made Shangju unique was that large portions of the area within the walls were not buildings but forests and meadows, hunting grounds where deer and other game roamed, a piece of the Mongol steppes enclosed within city walls. Marco's account describes Shangju with evident awe. He writes of the palace, its halls decorated with gold and paintings of dragons, birds, and battle scenes. He describes the interior spaces, vast rooms capable of holding thousands of people when the Khan gave audience or held feasts. He notes the gardens, where rare plants were cultivated, and the pavilions, elaborate structures overlooking artificial lakes. The palace was designed to impress, to demonstrate Kublai Khan's power and wealth, and it clearly achieved that effect on the young Venetian. The moment of audience with Kublai Khan must have been the culmination of years of anticipation and months of travel. The Polos approached the palace following strict protocols, for Mongol and Chinese court etiquette was elaborate and deviation could cause offense. They would have been escorted by officials, perhaps dressed in robes provided for the occasion, since their travel-worn clothes would not be appropriate for the Khan's presence. They would have rehearsed the proper forms of address and the gestures of respect expected in the Khan's presence. Kublai Khan in 1275 was about 60 years old, well past the average life expectancy of the time, a survivor in the brutal world of Mongol politics. He had secured his position as Great Khan through civil war with his younger brother Arigbok, a conflict that had effectively split the Mongol Empire into independent khanates that paid nominal allegiance to Kublai but acted independently. He had spent the past 2 decades consolidating his control over China, conquering the Southern Song dynasty, and establishing the Yuan dynasty that would rule China until 1368. Kublai was a complex figure who defied easy categorization. He was a Mongol warrior, descended from Genghis Khan, heir to a tradition of nomadic conquest. But he had spent his life in settled civilizations, primarily China, and he had been educated by Buddhist and Confucian tutors. He spoke Chinese fluently, patronized Chinese arts and scholarship, and attempted to rule according to Chinese imperial traditions. Yet he never forgot his Mongol heritage, spending summers in Shangju where he could hunt and live in a ger like his ancestors, maintaining Mongol military organizations, and keeping Mongols in key positions of power. The Khan's court was one of the most cosmopolitan gatherings in the medieval world. Chinese scholars and officials served alongside Mongol nobles. Muslim merchants and administrators held important positions, for Muslims dominated much of the long-distance trade and brought administrative skills valued by the Mongols. Christians were present too, members of the Nestorian church that had spread east from Persia, Armenians, and now the Polos, representing Catholic Europe. Buddhists, primarily Tibetan Buddhists who had gained Kublai's favor, competed for influence with Taoists and Confucians. The court was a place where people from across Eurasia met, exchanged ideas, and competed for the Khan's attention and favor. According to Marco's account, Kublai Khan was impressed by the young Venetian. Marco was intelligent, adaptable, and eager to learn. He quickly learned Mongolian and at least some Chinese. He demonstrated the observational skills and practical intelligence that made him useful to the Khan. And perhaps most importantly, as a foreigner with no ties to Chinese or Mongol factions, he could be trusted to report honestly on conditions in different parts of the empire without being influenced by local political considerations. Kublai began sending Marco on missions throughout his domains. These assignments took Marco to regions that few outsiders had ever visited, giving him opportunities to see China in ways that would not have been possible otherwise. He traveled with imperial authority, which meant that local officials had to cooperate with him, provide him with information, and ensure his safety. He observed administration, trade, natural resources, everything that might be of interest to the Khan. And he reported back, providing Kublai with information about the vast territories he ruled. China in the 13th century was, in many ways, the most advanced civilization on Earth. Its population was enormous, estimated at perhaps 100 million people, far more than all of Europe combined. Its cities were huge by medieval standards. Khanbaliq, the winter capital that Kublai was rebuilding, would become one of the world's greatest cities. Hangzhou, the former capital of the Southern Song dynasty, had a population of over 1 million, making it possibly the largest city in the world at that time. By comparison, Paris and Venice, among Europe's largest cities, each had perhaps 100,000 to 150,000 people. Chinese technology impressed Marco constantly. His account describes paper money, which China had been using for over a century but which was unknown in Europe. The idea that pieces of paper, backed by nothing but the government's authority, could be used to buy goods seemed almost magical. Yet in China, paper money was part of a sophisticated monetary system. The government issued notes in various denominations, controlled the money supply, and enforced acceptance of the currency. Merchants and individuals could deposit metal currency with the government and receive paper notes, or exchange notes for metal. The system had its problems. Inflation caused by overissuance of currency periodically disrupted the economy, but it worked remarkably well for its time. The postal system amazed Marco. The yam system that the Polos had used to travel to Shangju extended throughout the empire. Marco describes relay stations every 25 miles on major routes, each with fresh horses and provisions. He estimates that there were over 10,000 such stations across the empire, employing perhaps 300,000 horses and an army of messengers and support staff. The cost of maintaining this system was enormous, but it allowed rapid communication that was essential for governing such a vast territory. An urgent message could travel from Khanbaliq to the empire's western borders in a matter of weeks, a speed that would not be matched until the advent of the telegraph in the 19th century. Marco noted the use of coal for heating, describing it as a black stone that burned like logs. Coal was common in northern China but unknown in Europe, where wood and charcoal were the standard fuels. The Chinese had been mining and using coal for centuries, developing techniques to extract it and knowledge of how to use it effectively. Marco observed how coal produced more heat than wood, lasted longer, and was more economical in regions where timber was scarce. Porcelain fascinated him. Chinese ceramics were far superior to anything produced in Europe. The finest porcelain was translucent, beautifully decorated, and remarkably durable. Marco describes dishes so fine that light could be seen through them, decorated with painted designs or intricate glazes in colors European potters could not duplicate. Porcelain was one of China's most valuable exports, highly prized in markets from Japan to the Middle East, and its manufacture was a closely guarded secret. The printing of books struck Marco as remarkable. China had been printing texts using woodblock printing since the 9th century, and by Marco's time, printed books were common. Entire libraries existed containing thousands of printed volumes. By contrast, in Europe, books were still copied by hand, a laborious process that made them expensive and rare. A single handwritten book might take months to produce and cost a year's income for an ordinary person. In China, printed books were affordable enough that even modest scholars could own substantial libraries. Gunpowder and its military applications were in use, though the technology was still developing. The Chinese had invented gunpowder centuries earlier, initially using it for fireworks and signals. By Marco's time, it was being used in warfare, primarily in bombs and fire lances, tubes that propelled flames and shrapnel toward enemies. The Mongols had adopted and adapted these weapons, using them in sieges. Marco describes witnessing sieges where explosive bombs were catapulted into besieged cities, causing fires and terror. The full military potential of gunpowder, particularly in firearms and cannons, would not be realized for another century, but the foundations were being laid. Chinese cities impressed Marco with their size, organization, and sophistication. He describes Hangzhou, which he calls Qinsai, in extraordinary detail. The city was built on a network of canals, reminiscent of Venice but on a much larger scale. The canals served as streets, with boats replacing carts for transporting goods and people. Bridges, some of them engineering marvels, crossed the canals at regular intervals, many of them high enough to allow large boats to pass underneath while carrying road traffic above. The streets, where they existed, were paved, clean, and well maintained. Marco describes a system of garbage collection, with workers employed to clean streets and remove refuse. He notes public bathhouses, places where people could bathe for a small fee, a level of public hygiene uncommon in European cities. He describes markets organized by trade, with different streets dedicated to different goods, silk merchants on one street, spice dealers on another, goldsmiths in their own quarter, an organizational system that made it easy for buyers to find what they needed and for authorities to regulate trade. Fire prevention was a major concern in Chinese cities, where buildings were primarily constructed of wood. Marco describes fire watches that patrolled at night, looking for signs of fire and ready to raise alarms. He notes that major thoroughfares were wide enough to serve as fire breaks, preventing fires from spreading easily from one district to another. Large water cisterns were maintained throughout the city, providing water for firefighting. Despite these precautions, fires were still common and could be catastrophic, but the measures reduced their frequency and severity. The government of China under Mongol rule was a hybrid system that combined Mongol military authority with Chinese administrative traditions. Kublai Khan had proclaimed the Yuan dynasty, presenting himself as a Chinese emperor in the tradition of previous dynasties. He performed the imperial rituals, offered sacrifices at temples, and used Chinese symbols and titles. But the actual administration was dominated by Mongols and their allies, with Chinese, especially from the former southern Song territories, relegated to lower positions. The civil service examination system, which had been the path to government office in China for centuries, was suspended under Mongol rule. This system had selected officials based on their knowledge of Confucian classics and their ability to write essays demonstrating scholarship and literary skill. The exams had created a meritocratic element in Chinese government, allowing talented individuals from non-elite backgrounds to rise to high positions. The Mongols, distrusting this system and preferring to appoint people based on loyalty and ethnic background, effectively ended it during most of the Yuan period. This alienated Chinese scholars, many of whom withdrew from public life to pursue art, literature, or teaching. Marco's missions for Kublai Khan took him throughout China. He may have served as governor of Yangzhou, a major city on the Grand Canal, though historians debate this claim since Chinese records do not mention him. Whether he held that specific position or not, he clearly had administrative responsibilities and traveled extensively on official business. He visited the northern steppes and deserts, the fertile agricultural regions of central China, and the subtropical south with its rice paddies and tea plantations. In the southwest, in the provinces of Yunnan and Sichuan, Marco encountered regions that were ethnically diverse and had been incorporated into the Mongol Empire only recently. The peoples here were not ethnically Chinese but belonged to various groups, the Yi, Bai, Naxi, and others, each with their own languages and customs. Some had been conquered militarily, others had submitted to Mongol authority to avoid conquest. Marco describes the abundance of gold and precious stones in these regions, the skills of local craftsmen, and the distinctive cultures. The southeastern coast, with its great port cities, was China's window to maritime trade. Marco describes Quanzhou, which he calls Zayton, as one of the world's greatest trading ports. Ships arrived from India, bringing spices, precious stones, and exotic woods. Arab dhows came from the Persian Gulf and Red Sea ports, carrying dates, Arabian horses, and goods from the Middle East and Africa. Southeast Asian vessels brought tropical products, sandalwood, ivory, rhinoceros horn, and other items valued in Chinese markets. In exchange, these ships loaded Chinese silk, porcelain, tea, and manufactured goods that were prized from Japan to East Africa. The ships themselves were sophisticated vessels called junks, Chinese ocean-going ships that were among the most advanced in the world. Marco describes these ships in detail, noting features that surprised him. They were much larger than European ships, capable of carrying hundreds of tons of cargo and numerous passengers. They had multiple masts, typically 3 or 4, with sails made of bamboo matting reinforced with bamboo battens, a design that was strong and efficient. Most remarkably, the hulls were divided into watertight compartments, an innovation that Europeans would not adopt for centuries. If the hull was breached, only one compartment would flood, allowing the ship to remain afloat where a European ship would sink. Chinese navigation techniques impressed Marco. Chinese sailors used magnetic compasses, devices that had been known in China since at least the 11th century. The compass allowed navigation even when the sun and stars were not visible, crucial for ocean voyages. Chinese charts showed coastlines, harbors, navigational hazards, and currents, compiled from centuries of maritime experience. The knowledge of monsoon winds, the seasonal patterns that govern sailing in the Indian Ocean and South China Sea, was well developed, and Chinese captains planned their voyages to take advantage of favorable winds. Marco's account describes the incredible variety of goods available in Chinese markets. Silk, of course, was ubiquitous, from rough cloth used for everyday wear to fine fabrics embroidered with gold thread and worn only by the wealthy. Porcelain came in countless forms, from simple dishes to elaborate vessels decorated with landscapes, flowers, or mythological scenes. Tea, unknown in Europe, was cultivated in central and southern China, with different regions producing different varieties, each with its own flavor and characteristics. Spices, both those grown locally like ginger and those imported from Southeast Asia like black pepper and cinnamon, were widely available. Rice was the staple food in most of China, especially in the south where the warm, wet climate allowed 2 or even 3 crops per year. Marco describes the terraced rice paddies that climbed hillsides, the elaborate irrigation systems that controlled water flow to the fields, and the intensive labor required to cultivate rice. He notes that rice could feed far more people per acre than wheat, which partly explained China's large population. He observes different ways of preparing rice, from plain boiled rice to rice wine to rice vinegar to various dishes that combined rice with vegetables, fish, or meat. Chinese cuisine impressed Marco with its diversity and sophistication. Each region had its own specialties, its own flavors and techniques. The Cantonese of the south were known for their skill with seafood and their light, delicate flavors. The cuisine of Sichuan was spicy, using peppers and other seasonings to create intense flavors. Northern cuisine favored wheat-based foods like noodles and dumplings rather than rice. Chinese cooks used ingredients and techniques unknown in Europe: soy sauce and tofu made from soybeans, stir-frying in hot woks, steaming in bamboo baskets stacked over boiling water. The position of women in Chinese society was complex and varied by class. Elite women lived in relative seclusion, their lives centered on the family compound, their contact with unrelated men severely restricted. The practice of foot binding, which Marco mentions with evident distaste, was becoming widespread among upper-class families. Young girls' feet were bound tightly, breaking bones and reshaping the feet to make them small, typically only 3 or 4 inches long. This painful process crippled women, making it difficult for them to walk and impossible to run, ensuring that elite women remained confined to their homes. The practice was justified by aesthetic ideals that considered small feet beautiful and by social systems that valued female chastity above all else. Foot binding helped ensure that women could not easily leave home. Yet Marco also encountered women who wielded significant power, if usually indirectly. The wives and mothers of emperors could influence policy through their husbands and sons. Wealthy merchant families often had wives who managed household finances and even business operations. And among some of the non-Chinese peoples under Mongol rule, particularly nomadic groups, women had more freedom and authority than in traditional Chinese society, owning property, participating in economic decisions, and sometimes even riding and fighting alongside men. Chinese medicine fascinated Marco, though he didn't fully understand its theoretical foundations. Chinese physicians had been practicing for over 2,000 years, developing a sophisticated system based on concepts very different from European medical theory. They believed in qi, a life force or vital energy that flowed through the body along channels called meridians. Health depended on maintaining proper balance of yin and yang, complementary forces whose interaction governed all natural phenomena. Disease resulted from blockages or imbalances in qi, or from improper balance of yin and yang. Chinese doctors diagnosed illness through careful observation. They read pulses at multiple points on the body, noting subtle variations that supposedly indicated problems with specific organs or systems. They examined the tongue, looking at its color, coating, and texture. They asked detailed questions about symptoms, diet, emotions, and daily habits. Based on this information, they prescribed treatments that might include herbal medicines, acupuncture, moxibustion, dietary changes, or exercises like those that would later be systematized as Tai Chi. Herbal medicine was particularly sophisticated. Chinese pharmacology had identified hundreds of plants with medicinal properties and developed theories about how they interacted. Prescriptions typically combined multiple herbs in specific proportions, with the mixture designed to address the patient's specific imbalance. Some Chinese herbal treatments were effective by modern standards, using plants that contained active compounds with genuine therapeutic properties. Others were based on theories that modern science would not support, but the overall system represented centuries of accumulated clinical experience. The arts of China impressed Marco, though his merchant's perspective meant he often focused on commercial value rather than aesthetic merit. Chinese painting was already an ancient and sophisticated tradition. Landscape painting, which would reach its highest achievements in subsequent centuries, was developing the techniques and conventions that characterized Chinese art: the use of empty space, the emphasis on capturing the essence or spirit of a scene rather than realistic detail, the integration of calligraphy and painting. Marco saw paintings, though he may not have fully appreciated them by Chinese aesthetic standards, and he recognized that they were valued and collected by the wealthy. calligraphy was considered the highest of Chinese arts, the ultimate expression of an educated person's cultivation and character. Chinese writing, using characters rather than an alphabet, made calligraphy a unique art form. The same character could be written in numerous styles, each with its own aesthetic qualities. A master calligrapher's work was prized like great paintings in Europe, collected, studied, and used to judge the writer's qualities. Marco could not truly appreciate this art, since he could not read Chinese characters, but he observed the reverence with which Chinese treated fine calligraphy and understood that it represented something important in their culture. Music and theater were integral to Chinese court life and popular culture. Marco describes performances at Kublai Khan's court, elaborate shows with many performers, music from instruments that were unfamiliar to him, acrobatics, and drama. Chinese opera, which combined music, singing, stylized movement, and elaborate costumes, was already well developed. These performances were not realistic in the Western sense but highly stylized, with conventional gestures and movements that conveyed specific meanings to audiences familiar with the conventions. The Khan's court itself was a subject of endless fascination for Marco. Kublai Khan had multiple wives and many concubines, along with numerous children. The imperial household included thousands of people, servants, guards, officials, cooks, entertainers, scholars, artisans, all organized in a complex hierarchy. Court ceremonies blended Mongol and Chinese elements, creating unique rituals that served to display the Khan's power and reinforce the social order. Marco describes Kublai Khan's birthday celebrations, elaborate affairs lasting days, with feasts, performances, gift-giving, and audiences where officials and foreign dignitaries presented tribute and received the Khan's favor. He describes New Year celebrations following the Chinese lunar calendar, when thousands of officials and nobles would prostrate themselves before the Khan in synchronized ritual gestures of submission and respect. These ceremonies were carefully choreographed, with strict protocols governing who stood where, who wore what, and who could approach the Khan directly. The Khan's feasts were spectacular displays of wealth and power. Marco describes banquets with thousands of guests, served on golden plates, with entertainment provided by musicians, acrobats, and other performers. The variety of foods was staggering: meats from various animals, fish from rivers and seas, vegetables and fruits both local and exotic, drinks including wine, kumis, and other beverages. The leftovers from these feasts, still substantial after the guests had eaten their fill, were distributed to guards and servants, demonstrating the Khan's generosity. Kublai Khan's hunts were equally impressive. The Khan maintained vast hunting preserves, both at Shangju and elsewhere, stocked with deer, wild boar, and other game. When he hunted, thousands of men participated, nobles, guards, and beaters whose job was to drive game toward the hunters. The Khan hunted from horseback or from a platform carried by elephants, accompanied by trained hunting leopards and birds of prey, hawks and falcons raised and trained to catch game. These hunts were partly sport, partly practical. They provided meat for the court, but mostly they were displays of power, demonstrations of the Khan's dominion over nature and his command of vast resources. Marco spent 17 years in China, from approximately 1275 to 1292. During this time, he became wealthy, whether through trade, through gifts from the Khan, or both. He became comfortable in Chinese society, learning its languages, understanding its customs, adapting to its ways. He held positions of responsibility and trust, traveling widely on the Khan's business, seeing regions and peoples that few outsiders ever witnessed. By any measure, he had succeeded far beyond what he might have expected when he left Venice as a teenager. Yet the Polos never forgot that they were Venetians, foreigners in a foreign land. As the years passed and Kublai Khan aged, they grew increasingly concerned about their position. The Khan was in his 70s, old by medieval standards. When he died, the succession might be contested, and in the turmoil that could follow, foreigners like the Polos could become targets. They had asked permission to leave, but Kublai valued their services and was reluctant to let them go. The opportunity finally came in 1291. A Mongol princess named Kokachin was to be sent to Persia to marry the Ilkhan Arjhan. The overland routes were disrupted by conflicts between different Mongol khanates, so it was decided to send her by sea. The Polos, with their knowledge of the Western world and their diplomatic skills, were asked to escort her. This gave them the excuse they needed to leave with the Khan's blessing. The sea voyage from China to Persia was an epic journey in its own right, a maritime odyssey that would take the Polos through waters few Europeans had ever sailed and to lands that existed only as rumors in the West. A fleet of 14 ships, carrying the Princess Kokachin, her retinue of servants and guards, the Polos, and hundreds of others, set out from Gwangju in 1291. These were Chinese junks, large ocean-going vessels each capable of carrying hundreds of passengers and enormous quantities of supplies. The fleet's size and composition reflected the importance of the mission. Escorting a princess to marry the ruler of Persia was a matter of diplomatic significance, and Kublai Khan was determined to ensure her safe arrival. The journey began by sailing south along the coast of China, a route that took them past numerous ports and coastal cities. This was familiar territory for Chinese mariners, waters that had been sailed for centuries. But as the fleet continued south, they entered regions that were less familiar to the Chinese and completely unknown to the Polos. They visited the kingdom of Champa, located in what is now central and southern Vietnam. Champa was an Indianized kingdom, one of many Southeast Asian states that had adopted elements of Indian culture, religion, and political organization while maintaining their own distinctive characteristics. Marco's account describes Champa with the same attention to detail he brought to China. He notes that the people were dark-skinned, that they went about nearly naked in the tropical heat, and that they worshipped idols, his term for the Hindu and Buddhist deities that dominated Southeast Asian religion. He describes the abundant products of the region, aromatic woods like sandalwood and eaglewood that were highly valued for incense, spices including the precious black pepper that Europe craved, and exotic animals including elephants that were used in warfare and labor. The fleet continued south and west, crossing the South China Sea to the island of what is now Indonesia. This was the realm of spices, the legendary spice islands that European merchants had heard of but had never reached directly. The Polos visited Java, one of the largest islands, where powerful kingdoms controlled the production and trade of pepper, nutmeg, cloves, and other spices that were worth fortunes in European and Middle Eastern markets. Marco describes Java as a rich and populous island, with sophisticated cities, productive agriculture, and valuable trade goods. He observed the religious practices of the Javanese, noting temples and rituals that he interpreted through his limited understanding. What he saw was likely a mixture of Hinduism and Buddhism, religions that had been established in Java for centuries and had blended with older indigenous beliefs. He noted the use of tattoos and body modification, practices common in island Southeast Asia. He described the tropical vegetation, plants and trees that bore fruits unknown in temperate climates, coconut palms, banana trees, and the massive durian fruit with its distinctive smell. The fleet sailed on to Sumatra, another large island that was becoming increasingly important in maritime trade networks. Sumatra was located at a strategic point controlling the narrow straits between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, and kingdoms on the island grew wealthy by controlling this vital waterway. Marco describes the island's products: gold from interior mines, camphor and benzoin, aromatic resins used in medicine and religious ceremonies, and the exotic rhinoceros, which he describes with evident confusion, apparently expecting the unicorn of European legend and instead finding a creature very different from what myths had led him to expect. The diversity of peoples and cultures in Southeast Asia impressed and sometimes confused Marco. Each island, each kingdom, seemed to have its own language, customs, and beliefs. Some were Hindu, others Buddhist, still others followed beliefs that combined elements from multiple traditions with indigenous practices. The political organization varied from highly centralized kingdoms with elaborate court rituals to more loosely organized federations of trading cities. What united the region was trade. The goods that flowed through these islands connected China to India, India to the Middle East, and ultimately linked all of Asia into vast commercial networks. The sea journey itself was arduous and dangerous. The ships depended on monsoon winds, seasonal patterns of wind direction that dictated when sailing was possible and in which direction. Navigating required skill and experience, using compasses, charts showing coastlines and hazards, observations of stars and landmarks, and knowledge passed down through generations of mariners. Storms were a constant threat. Tropical cyclones could destroy even the largest ships, and the fleet had to seek shelter when threatening weather approached. But the greatest danger was disease. Crowded ships with poor sanitation, tropical heat and humidity, water that went stale in storage, and exposure to unfamiliar pathogens created conditions for disease to spread. Dysentery, probably caused by contaminated food or water, struck periodically, causing devastating diarrhea that could kill within days through dehydration. Fevers of various types afflicted crew and passengers, some probably malaria spread by mosquitoes in coastal ports, others perhaps dengue or other tropical diseases for which Europeans had no immunity. Infections from minor wounds could become deadly in the tropical climate where bacteria thrived. The toll was horrific. Marco's account states that of the original 600 people who began the voyage, fewer than 20 survived. This mortality rate, over 96%, seems almost unbelievable, and some historians question whether Marco misremembered the numbers or whether his account was exaggerated in later copying. But even if the actual death toll was lower, it's clear that the voyage was catastrophic. People died constantly, their bodies committed to the sea with whatever religious rites could be performed aboard ship, their possessions distributed among survivors, their names eventually forgotten by all but immediate family. Yet the Princess Cocochin survived, as did the Polos. Whether through luck, stronger constitutions, better access to food and water, or divine favor as Marco might have believed, they endured when hundreds around them perished. The fleet, much reduced in numbers and perhaps with some ships lost entirely, eventually reached the coast of India, the vast subcontinent that connected East Asia to the Middle East and whose products had driven international trade for millennia. India was a land of profound complexity and diversity, with dozens of kingdoms, hundreds of languages, and religious traditions that included Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Islam, and others. The coastal regions, where the fleet stopped, were heavily involved in maritime trade. Ports like Quilon on the Malabar coast and cities on the Coromandel coast were where goods from across Asia were bought, sold, and redistributed. Indian textiles, fine cotton fabrics that were lighter and more comfortable than European woolens, were highly valued across Asia. Precious stones, rubies from Ceylon, diamonds from interior mines, were traded through Indian ports. And spices, pepper from the Malabar coast, cinnamon from Ceylon, cardamom and ginger from various regions, were central to India's trading economy. Marco observed Indian society with the same curious but somewhat uncomprehending eye he had brought to everything else. The caste system, which divided society into hereditary groups with different occupations and social statuses, struck him as strange. Brahmins, the priestly caste, held high status despite often being materially poor. Warriors and rulers formed another high-status caste. Merchants and farmers occupied intermediate positions. And at the bottom were laborious and those considered untouchable, people whose occupations or ancestry placed them outside the normal social order entirely. The system was ancient and complex, justified by Hindu religious philosophy, and rigidly enforced through social customs and sometimes legal codes. Hindu temples and religious practices fascinated Marco, though he often misunderstood what he observed. He describes temples with multiple deities, which to his Catholic Christian sensibility seemed like demon worship. He did not understand that Hinduism is fundamentally monotheistic despite its multiplicity of divine forms, that the various gods and goddesses are understood as manifestations of a single ultimate reality. He observes rituals involving fire, offerings of flowers and food, the singing of hymns in Sanskrit, but without cultural context, these practices seemed exotic and inexplicable. Buddhism, which had originated in India but had largely been displaced by Hinduism except in certain regions, also attracted Marco's attention. He describes Buddhist monasteries and monks, their practices of meditation and asceticism, their vegetarian diets, and their rejection of material possessions. Some scholars believe that Marco's descriptions of Buddha show a glimmer of recognition, that he saw in Buddha's life story parallels to Christian saints and almost considered Buddhism a form of Christianity, albeit a corrupted one. This was not accurate, but it represented an attempt to understand an alien religious tradition through familiar frameworks. The wealth of Indian rulers impressed Marco greatly. He describes kings and sultans who adorned themselves with enormous gemstones, who maintained courts with thousands of attendants, who commanded armies of elephants and cavalry. The display of wealth in Indian courts rivaled or exceeded what Marco had seen in China, with golden thrones, jeweled crowns, and treasuries filled with precious stones. Much of this wealth came from trade. India's position connecting East and West allowed its rulers to profit from goods passing through their territories. But some came from the land itself, from India's productive agriculture, skilled craftsmen, and mines that yielded gems and gold. Marco describes the practice of pearl diving off the Indian coast, a dangerous occupation where divers descended to the sea floor to retrieve oysters that might contain pearls. The divers worked without breathing equipment, simply holding their breath as they descended in water that could be 40 or 50 feet deep, feeling along the bottom for oysters, filling baskets, and returning to the surface before their breath ran out. Sharks were a constant danger, and divers often carried knives or prayed to gods for protection. The pearls they retrieved, when found, could be enormously valuable, perfect spheres of lustrous nacre that were prized in jewelry across the world. From India, the fleet continued west across the Arabian Sea to the Persian Gulf, finally reaching the port of Hormuz. This was the same city where the Polos had turned back from taking ship nearly 20 years earlier, now approached from the opposite direction after sailing around the entire rim of maritime Asia. Hormuz was hot, humid, and unhealthy, but it was also wealthy, profiting from its strategic location controlling access to the Persian Gulf. Here, the long sea voyage ended. The Princess Kokochin would continue overland to her destination, and the Polos would begin their journey home. But they learned distressing news at Hormuz. Arjun, the ill Khan of Persia who Kokochin was supposed to marry, had died while they were at sea. The princess was instead married to Argun's son, Ghazan, maintaining the alliance between the Yuan dynasty and the Ilkhanate that the marriage was meant to cement. For the Polos, this news meant that their diplomatic mission was complete, and they were free to continue to Venice. The journey through Persia was bittersweet, following routes they had traveled in the opposite direction so many years ago. They were older now, in their 40s and 60s, still vigorous but no longer young. They had spent more than half their adult lives in Asia, had become wealthy beyond what most Venetian merchants could dream of, had witnessed wonders and accumulated knowledge that no other Europeans possessed. But they were also tired, ready to go home, to see Venice again after nearly a quarter century away. They traveled through cities they had visited on the outward journey, Yazd, Kerman, and others, noting changes, remembering their younger selves passing through these same places. They probably took a northern route through Persia this time, passing through Tabriz, the capital of the Ilkhanate, before continuing west toward the Black Sea or the Mediterranean. The details are unclear in Marco's account, which was written years later and focuses more on descriptions of places than on the chronology of the return journey. Eventually, they reached territories controlled by Christian powers, perhaps through Armenia or through Byzantine-controlled regions. They crossed into Europe, perhaps through Constantinople, the great city that straddled the boundary between Europe and Asia, between the Christian and Muslim worlds. And finally, they boarded a Venetian ship for the last leg of their journey, sailing across the Mediterranean to Venice, completing a circuit of most of Eurasia that had taken nearly 24 years. From Persia, the Polos made their way home. They crossed territories they had traveled through 25 years earlier, though now they were traveling west rather than east. Now they were ending a journey rather than beginning one. They reached the Mediterranean, crossed to Constantinople, and finally boarded a ship for Venice. In 1295, nearly 24 years after their departure, the three Polos, Niccolo, Maffeo, and Marco, returned to Venice. Their return was strange and difficult in ways they had not anticipated. Venice had changed in their absence, though not as much as they had changed. The city had continued its commercial expansion, had fought wars with Genoa and other rivals, had seen political shifts and the rise and fall of merchant families. But the physical city, its canals and buildings, its churches and markets, was recognizably the same. The Polos, however, were not the same people who had left in 1271. They dressed differently, wearing clothes that blended Venetian styles with Eastern influences, fabrics and cuts that marked them as foreign in their own hometown. They spoke Italian with accents, their Venetian dialect rusty from disuse, peppered with words and phrases from Persian, Turkish, Mongolian, and Chinese that crept into their speech unbidden. They had habits and mannerisms acquired in the East, ways of eating, of greeting others, of conducting business that seemed strange to Venetians who had never left the Mediterranean world. According to later accounts, probably embellished but perhaps containing some truth, their relatives didn't recognize them initially. The story tells that they arrived at their family house dressed in worn travel clothes, claiming to be the Polos who had left decades earlier. The family who had taken over the house, distant relatives or perhaps strangers, did not believe them. Only when the travelers produced proof, tearing open the linings of their travel-worn coats to reveal gems and valuable items sewn inside, did the family accept their identity. The story captures something true even if the specific details are invented. The Polos had been gone so long that they had been forgotten by many, presumed dead by some. They had no place ready for them in Venetian society, no obvious niche where they fit comfortably. They were famous almost immediately, their tales of the East spreading through Venice's merchant community, but they were also outsiders, people who had seen too much, who knew too much about a world that most Venetians could not imagine and many did not believe existed as described. Marco settled back into Venetian life as best he could. He had wealth, the accumulated profits of nearly 2 decades of trade and service in the East. He probably used this wealth in typical Venetian fashion, investing in commercial ventures, buying property, lending money to other merchants, establishing himself as a solid member of Venice's commercial elite. But he was never one of the richest or most powerful Venetians. Other families, who had stayed in Venice and carefully cultivated their commercial and political positions, remained at the top of Venetian society. The Polos were wealthy and noteworthy, but not quite part of the innermost circles of power. Venice in 1295 was at war with Genoa, a conflict that had been ongoing intermittently for decades. Venice and Genoa were the two greatest maritime powers in the Mediterranean, and they competed ferociously for control of trade routes, for commercial privileges in foreign ports, for dominance of key commodities. Their rivalry sometimes led to open warfare, naval battles that could involve hundreds of ships and thousands of men, battles that could determine which city would control crucial markets for years to come. In 1298, 3 years after his return, Marco Polo was given command of a galley, one of the war vessels in Venice's fleet. This was an honor, recognition of his status and perhaps his experience, though commanding a galley in battle required skills he may not have possessed, having spent his time in merchant vessels and Chinese ships rather than in Venetian war galleys. The Battle of Curzala, fought in September 1298 off the Dalmatian coast, was a disaster for Venice. The Genoese fleet, commanded by skilled admirals and perhaps having numerical superiority, defeated the Venetian fleet decisively. Thousands of Venetians were killed or captured, including Marco Polo. Marco was imprisoned in Genoa, held in conditions that were probably not too harsh by medieval standards. He was a gentleman prisoner, someone from a wealthy family who could eventually be ransomed or exchanged, not a common sailor who might be enslaved or left to rot in a dungeon. Genoa's prisons, while certainly uncomfortable, allowed prisoners of means to have visitors, to receive food and other items from outside, and to interact with other prisoners. It was during this imprisonment that the story of Marco Polo's travels became the book that would make him famous for centuries to come. Marco shared a cell or at least had extensive contact with Rustichello da Pisa, sometimes called Rusticiano, a writer who had previously composed romances in French, tales of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, stories of chivalry and adventure that were popular entertainment for the aristocracy. Rustichello recognized that Marco's stories had potential, that they could be shaped into a work that would find an audience. Over months, perhaps as much as a year, Marco dictated his experiences, and Rustichello wrote them down, not in Italian but in Franco-Italian, a literary language used for romances and other popular works. The process of creating the book involved significant shaping and editing. Marco's memories, detailed but not organized chronologically or thematically, had to be structured into a narrative that readers could follow. Rustichello added literary flourishes, standardized descriptions, and probably embellished some details to make them more engaging. The result was a hybrid work, part travel account, part geographic compendium, part merchant's handbook, and part romance, mixing factual observations with incredible tales, practical information about trade goods with stories of marvels and wonders. The book that emerged from this collaboration was titled Devisement du Monde, or Description of the World in French, though it would become known by various titles in different languages. In Italian, it was often called Illinois Million, either referring to Marco's nickname or to the countless wonders he described. In English, it became simply The Travels of Marco Polo, a title that captures its essential nature while oversimplifying its complex character. Marco was released from Genoese imprisonment in 1299, probably as part of a peace treaty between Venice and Genoa or perhaps through a ransom paid by his family. He returned to Venice and settled into the life of a prosperous merchant. In 1300, he married Donata Badua, a woman from a respectable Venetian family. The marriage, arranged according to Venetian customs, connected Marco to another merchant network and re-established his position in Venetian society. He and Donata had 3 daughters, Fantina, Bellella, and Moretta, who survived to adulthood and married into other Venetian families, creating connections that would benefit the Polo family commercially and socially. Marco's daily life in Venice during his final 2 decades was probably typical for a merchant of his status. He conducted business from his house, receiving visitors, negotiating deals, managing investments in various trading ventures. He may have owned ships or shares in ships, participating in the risky but potentially profitable business of Mediterranean trade. He probably attended sessions of the Great Council if his family's status entitled him to membership, participating in the governance of the Republic. He certainly attended religious services, for Catholic Christianity permeated Venetian life, and he probably made donations to churches, endowing masses for his soul and his family's welfare. But Marco also lived with his memories of the East, a part of his life that had been more intense and remarkable than anything most Venetians experienced. He could look at goods in Venetian markets, silks and spices imported through intermediaries, and remember seeing those items at their sources. He could hear travelers' tales of distant lands and know that he had been further than any of them. He could read his book, which was being copied and circulated, and see his experiences transformed into literature, his memories becoming public property to be read, doubted, and debated by people he would never meet. The book was both a success and a source of controversy from its earliest days. Copies spread across Europe, translated from the original Franco-Italian into Latin, Italian, French, and other languages. Each copying introduced errors, changes, additions, and omissions, so that no two manuscripts were identical, and the task of determining what Marco actually said versus what copyists added became nearly impossible. The book was read by merchants seeking information about Asian markets, by scholars curious about distant lands, by rulers considering alliances or military ventures, and by ordinary people who simply enjoyed reading about exotic places and peoples. But many doubted the book's truthfulness. The scale of what Marco described seemed impossible to many European readers. Cities with populations of over 1 million, when the largest European cities had at most 100,000 or 150,000. Paper money, accepted as having value though made of worthless material. Coal that burned? Birds that carried away elephants, likely a misunderstood description of the rock from Arabian tales that Marco incorporated? Some readers dismissed the entire book as fiction, a romance dressed up as a travel account, no more truthful than tales of King Arthur that Rustic Hello had written before. Others believed parts while doubting others, trying to separate fact from exaggeration, truth from error, first-hand observation from second-hand tales. The absence of certain details bothered skeptics. Marco doesn't clearly describe the Great Wall of China, though it existed in his time, leading some to question whether he had actually been to China. He doesn't mention tea drinking clearly in most manuscripts, though tea was ubiquitous in China, another potential sign that he was reporting stories he had heard rather than things he had seen. His name appears in no Chinese records, though few foreigners' names were recorded, and the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Modern historians continue to debate the book's authenticity and accuracy. Some argue forcefully that Marco never went to China, that he compiled his account from information provided by Persian or Arab merchants, that he spent his time in Mongol territories in Central Asia or Persia rather than in China proper. They point to the inconsistencies, the absences, the occasional errors in describing Chinese customs or geography. They note that some of Marco's most detailed descriptions are of regions on the periphery of China or of maritime routes that he could have learned about from sailors and merchants without traveling them himself. Other historians defend Marco's account, pointing out that many of his descriptions have been verified by archaeological evidence or by comparison with Chinese historical records. They note that the level of detail in many passages suggests first-hand observation, that Marco describes things that would have been very difficult to learn second-hand. They explain the absences and errors as resulting from the circumstances of the book's composition, dictated from memory years after the events, shaped by a collaborator with his own agenda, copied and recopied by scribes who introduced changes. They argue that the book, while not perfectly accurate, represents a genuine eyewitness account of travel in Asia during the Mongol period. The truth probably lies between the extremes. Marco almost certainly went to China and spent significant time there, but perhaps not 17 years, perhaps not in all the places and positions he claims. He probably observed many of the things he describes but also incorporated stories he heard from others, tales that he believed were true but that he had not witnessed personally. He remembered some things incorrectly, forgot details, conflated events, and perhaps embellished stories to make them more impressive. Rustic Hello added his own touches, literary conventions, and romance elements that make it harder to separate fact from fiction. What cannot be doubted is the book's influence. It became one of the most widely read travel accounts of the medieval and early modern periods. It shaped European perceptions of Asia for centuries. Merchants used it as a source of commercial intelligence, noting what goods were available where, what prices might be obtained, what routes were passable. Geographers incorporated Marco's information into their maps and descriptions of the world, gradually replacing ancient misconceptions with more accurate knowledge based on Marco's observations. Explorers and adventurers read the book and dreamed of following Marco's route or finding new ways to reach the lands he described. Christopher Columbus owned a heavily annotated copy of Marco Polo's book, and his voyage across the Atlantic was driven partly by the desire to find a western route to the China that Marco described. Columbus's copy, which survives today in a library in Seville, is filled with marginal notes, underlines, and comments, evidence of how closely he studied the text and how much it influenced his thinking about Asian geography and the potential profits of direct trade with China. The book also influenced literature and culture in ways that are harder to quantify but equally important. The image of the East that Marco presented, exotic, wealthy, sophisticated, and strange, became embedded in European consciousness. China became the epitome of a distant land of wonders, a place of vast cities, strange customs, and incredible wealth. The stereotypes and misconceptions that would shape European attitudes toward Asia for centuries had their roots partly in Marco's book, which, whatever its accuracy, was for most Europeans their primary source of information about the East. Marco Polo lived quietly in Venice for the final 24 years of his life. He was known, respected, wealthy but not extraordinarily so, perhaps somewhat eccentric for continuing to tell stories about the East that many dismissed as exaggerations. He conducted business, raised his daughters, participated in Venetian civic and religious life. He grew older, perhaps suffered from the ailments that come with age, certainly watched as the world changed around him. He died on January 8 or 9, 1324, probably in his house in Venice, surrounded by family. He was about 70 years old, having lived a longer life than most people in his era. According to some accounts, on his deathbed, friends urged him to recant the lies in his book, to confess that he had exaggerated or invented his tales of the East. Marco supposedly replied that he had not told half of what he had actually seen, that the reality surpassed anything he could have conveyed in words. Whether this story is true or apocryphal, it captures something essential about Marco Polo, his insistence that the wonders he had witnessed were real, that the world was stranger and more marvelous than most people imagined. His will, a legal document that survives, carefully divided his property among his family members. His wife Donata received a portion, as was standard in Venetian inheritance law. His 3 daughters received dowries and inheritances that would allow them to maintain their social position. Various bequests went to religious institutions and charities, a common practice meant to secure prayers for the deceased soul and demonstrate piety. The will mentioned specific items, household goods, business interests, suggesting a prosperous but not fabulously wealthy man. There is no mention in the will of the book, which probably had little commercial value at the time since copies were made by scribes and authors did not receive royalties. Marco was buried in the Church of San Lorenzo in Venice. The church was later demolished and rebuilt, and the exact location of Marco's remains is unknown today, lost like so many details of medieval lives, even the lives of the famous. But the physical disappearance of his grave hardly matters. Marco Polo's legacy is not in his bones but in his book, in the journey he made, and in what both have meant to subsequent generations. The story of Marco Polo represents something fundamental about human nature, the curiosity that drives us to explore, the courage required to venture into the unknown, and the desire to share what we have learned with others. Marco was not a great writer, his book was ghostwritten. He was not a diplomat or scholar, he was a merchant. He was not even necessarily a great explorer in the sense of discovering new lands, he followed established trade routes, visited cities where other travelers had been. But he went further than almost any European of his generation, he observed carefully, and he told his story in a way that has resonated for over 700 years. The legacy of Marco Polo extends far beyond his lifetime. He represents the age-old human impulse toward exploration and discovery, the desire to see what lies beyond familiar horizons. He embodies the merchant adventurer, willing to venture into unknown lands seeking profit and knowledge. His journey demonstrated that the world was vastly larger and more diverse than most Europeans imagined, that sophisticated civilizations existed beyond Christendom, and that contact with those civilizations could be both profitable and enlightening. The Silk Road that Marco traveled would continue for another century and a half, though its importance gradually declined. The fall of the Mongol Empire, the rise of new powers in Central Asia, the devastation of the Black Death plague that traveled along trade routes, and changes in technology and commerce all contributed to the decline of the overland routes. Maritime routes, initially supplementing overland trade, eventually replaced it as European powers developed the ships and navigation techniques to sail directly to Asia. The world was entering a new era, one in which Europe would no longer be isolated on the western periphery of Eurasia but would reach out to create global networks of trade and empire. Marco Polo's journey was in many ways a hinge point in history, one of the last great travels of the medieval Silk Road and a herald of the age of exploration that would follow. His book preserved a vision of Asia at a unique moment, the Mongol Empire at its height, when it seemed possible for an Italian merchant to travel from Venice to Beijing and back, to serve a Khan in China and return to tell the tale. The story of Marco Polo reminds us that history is made by individuals willing to venture beyond the familiar, to risk everything in pursuit of knowledge, profit, or simply the desire to see what lies beyond the horizon. It reminds us that cultural exchange, even when driven by commercial motives, enriches all participants, bringing new ideas, new technologies, and new perspectives. And it reminds us that the world has always been more connected than we might imagine, that goods, ideas, and people have been traveling vast distances for thousands of years, creating the rich tapestry of human civilization. If you've enjoyed this journey through history, following Marco Polo's travels along the Silk Road and across the Gobi Desert, into the court of Kublai Khan and through the cities of medieval China, consider leaving a like, subscribing to the channel, or sharing your thoughts in the comments. These simple actions help others discover these stories and make it possible to create more content exploring the fascinating details of human history. As you drift off to sleep, perhaps you can imagine yourself on that journey, walking the streets of Samarkand, riding across the Gobi Desert under brilliant stars, sailing past tropical islands, entering the vast halls of Kublai Khan's palace. History is not just dates and facts but human experiences, journeys taken and obstacles overcome, wonders witnessed and lessons learned. Marco Polo's journey ended over 700 years ago, but the story continues every time someone is inspired to look beyond their own world, to seek understanding of other cultures, to venture into the unknown. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with distant lands, ancient cities, and the endless fascinating complexity of our shared human story across time and space. Good night.